All right, welcome back to Bigfoot's Wilderness. I have a new encounter story for you today. It's called The Legend of the Smoky Mountain Bigfoot, which is kind of timely since there's a Bigfoot conference going on in the Smoky Mountains as we speak. I guess it's kind of wrapping up. Wished I could have gone. But anyway, I've got a great story for you. I'm especially proud of this one story because I've been working with this gentleman for over a year, back and forth with emails. So I hope you enjoy it. So let's get into it. For most of my life, I've lived close to and recently at the foot of the Smoky Mountains. I was born in Gatlinburg and will likely die here too. I turned 78 this September, and like most people, have a few hundred issues with my body. And as for my age, well, they have been here a lot longer than I've been alive, so I don't feel so old. I'll get to them in a moment. My great-grandparents settled in these woods and mountains before it was ever known as Gatlinburg. My great-grandfather, Charles, had written a few stories about the Civil War that were downright fascinating. But what he shared in a different kind of story was of an encounter that occurred on his homestead. To be put bluntly, to him, they would be known as the Wild People. As far as he could recollect, they just appeared one day and made themselves at home in his woods. According to his entry, several things seemed to happen at about the same time. It was near the end of the year 1863, and there was an infamous little incident called the Battle of the Berg, where Confederate soldiers basically were outnumbered from the onset and were driven out of the Smoky Mountains by Union soldiers. Now, I'm not a history major, but from what I could gather, there was shooting and fighting, but no real casualties to mention. People and soldiers fled into the Smoky Mountains for their lives. Great-granddad Charles' story also added in a strange twist. Days after the skirmish, the woods around his land were different. Something changed. It had an eerie presence, like something was following you. On his farm, on occasion, livestock would go missing. Now, that isn't totally unusual, but sometimes things would literally just go bump in the night. Heavy footsteps could be heard, barn doors were opened, fences knocked down, enormous bare naked footprints were found all over the farm. There seemed to be more than one size print, and they were all bigger and wider than Charles's foot. If he put two and two together, which he didn't initially, it was like something was searching his property. He enjoyed hunting and teaching his oldest son, William Thomas, what to look for as he knew these woods inside and out. But again, he felt like something was watching him, and he just couldn't seem to shake it. It wouldn't be long before what he called an improper introduction would be made. Just around dawn one morning, his son William had shot a large buck, but it had kept running, and now the two were trying to pursue the blood trail, which baffled them as it seemed heavy, but then just stopped. As they rounded a large bush, just ahead of them they heard something crashing. Both chased after the noises, young William leading the way. Excited to have finally been done pursuing, he nearly fell over backwards in fright at the sight of what appeared to be a large dark-haired animal growling and sprawled across his deer kill. It seemed to have sliced its stomach open and was feasting on its organs. Its hands and face were smeared with blood. Its teeth were jagged and yellow. He wrote down the word grotesque and massive in size, twice his girth from belly to chest and covered in hair from head to toe, almost like a bear, but it wasn't a bear. It was nearly impossible for him to explain what it was. I suppose a wild-looking man explained it best, but still it appeared more animal at the same time. Only 30 feet away at the most, Charles stepped in front of his son, dropped his rifle, and pulled out his loaded Colt pistol, taking aim at its head. Charles's hands were trembling, but managed to cock his pistol, and cursing it as an abomination, promising to fire every lead ball into its head. And he would have, if it weren't for the fact that its eyes went wide and then it kind of winced, almost like it knew what a gun was. Charles lowered the gun, stepped back, and reached down for his rifle, and then he spoke to it. "I don't know if you can understand me. You can have this one, but you better watch yourself when I'm hunting. I have a family to feed too." Charles had heard of wild men before, but he just dismissed it for lack of evidence. Now he had proof, being face to face with one. Afterwards, both were shaken, and each struggled to understand what it was they saw. And they both dealt with it in different ways. William feared the woods now, and would have nightmares, and Charles began drinking heavily, most likely why he died in his 60s. Documenting the encounter with what he could translate was amazing, but having my grandfather add additional details and the raw emotion really brought another aspect. The following story is from my grandfather, William Thomas. The wild people continued to frequent our land over the weeks and months and onward from season to season. I couldn't blame them. The land was teeming with wildlife, but it did seem that they were giving us a wide berth. Not always, but when we'd leave to go hunting and step out the front door, off in the distance where the fields met the tree line, you could make out a tree or two slightly swaying, and large, dark figures scurrying up and down those trees. No man could climb a tree vertically with just his arms and legs. They had to be something else. And their speed and how they climbed was uncanny. They seemed to almost jump halfway up the tree, and then would quickly crawl up into the canopy. It was unnerving that they kept watching our family's whereabouts. We wondered if these things were nervous and weary as they kept their distance, and it may have been partly out of fear, but also respect, or maybe respect of my granddad's firearms. Finally, Charles told the family about the wild people. They were instructed to always carry a weapon and never enter the deep woods. I was the oldest, so my job was to be armed and vigilant. We continued to keep a lookout over livestock, fences, and barn, but every now and then, inevitably, something would go missing from the smokehouse. It was like they couldn't help themselves. Was it from hunger or just being a lazy opportunist? He had no doubt, with their sheer size and speed, that they would have no problem chasing down any rabbit, deer, pig, or even a bear, but yet they stole from him. My dad, Charles, was enraged and decided he would reinforce the smokehouse doors. One evening, as the family finished dinner, he heard the unmistakable sound of wood cracking and splintering, and it was coming from behind the house. Charles jumped up from the table and quickly ran behind the cabin to the smokehouse to find two of these wild men attempting to carry off as much meat as their arms could carry. Maybe it was from the drinking, or maybe he just plain forgot, but he didn't have a gun. This would be the very first time that he was able to see how tall these things really were. Now, I was 15 at the time and about as tall as my dad, and these things were a good 3 feet taller. I would say almost 9 feet tall. My dad waved his hands at them, yelling to get out of here, and I swear I saw emotion on their faces. Back then, we didn't know what a gorilla was, but a few decades later, when I saw a picture, it looked similar, except the nose was flatter and lighter and the face was more human. But the emotion I saw that evening was of surprise and then a hasty retreat, but still carrying armfuls of our food. But it's more likely that my mother had been standing behind us, pointing a rifle at them. They feared guns more than anything. I don't think she ever really believed it until she saw it, and she never really got over it. She did her best to pretend it never happened. And that was my grandfather's story, William Thomas. They're all gone, but I still live on a smaller plot of land in a newer home. We sold off pieces of our property years ago. My only possible encounter of my own happened just a few years back as I cut down several trees for firewood. I'd taken the week off from work to get some of the honeydew list done. I'd stacked most of the cut wood between trees and had some large scraps left over and intended to build a crude bench for the backyard. I had one large piece of the trunk laying by the wood line about 50 feet away from my back porch. As I left for town to pick up a few things and grab some lunch, I noticed that that same trunk of tree was now laying in my front yard upon my return. That was unusual since it probably weighed at least 100 pounds. I know I didn't put it there, and the ground had a very large divot, like it was thrown. I can't say I've ever noticed anything before, but I imagine my family's encounters will surely stay with me. If I seem aloof about an exact location, it's probably not that surprising that those I've shared my story with have mostly dismissed it, maybe as much as 9 out of 10. I appreciate you, Mike, indulging me and letting me share, but it looks like Bigfoot gets to stay a legend, the legend of the Smoky Mountains.